continue. Now, we are already on the kinds of obligation according to object. Now, in the early part of our class, we had already classified the different kinds of obligation. The classification then was with regard to the subject matter of an obligation. So we did classify kind of obligation as to subject matter, whether the obligation is a real obligation or a personal obligation. Now this time, we will be classifying the kinds of obligation according to object. Now there are only two kinds of obligation according to object. One is a simple obligation, and then second is a compound obligation. Now, a simple obligation is one where there is only one prestation. When I speak about prestation, I am referring to the object of the obligation. Now, how do we identify the object of an obligation? Okay. Now, in order to determine the object of the obligation, you just ask yourselves, what will the debtor give or what will the debtor perform? Okay? Unsa ang ihatag or unsa ang buhaton on the basis of the obligation? The answer to that is considered as the object of the obligation or what we call as prestation. So, when the obligation states that Maria promised to give a specific car in favor of Pedro. Okay. So, here first identify who is the debtor and who is the creditor. In that example, the debtor is Maria and the creditor is Pedro. Now, since we have identified now who is the debtor, then ask yourselves what will be the thing or the object that will be given or what will be performed. Okay? Unsa may ihatag ni Maria or unsa may buhaton ni Maria. In our example, Maria promised to give Pedro a specific car. So therefore, in that obligation, the object is the car. Okay? So, the car, since we refer also object as prestation, the car is also considered as the prestation. So, in simple obligation, it is one where there is only one prestation. So, meaning, in this kind of obligation, there is only one object of the obligation. Okay? So the example is, Maria promised to give a specific car to Pedro. Here, there is only one object, which is the car. So that is considered as a simple obligation. However, a compound obligation is a kind of obligation where there are two or more prestations. So this time, there are two or more objects of the obligation. Like for example, Maria promised to give Pedro a car and a motorcycle. Okay? So, here there are two objects, the car and the motorcycle. So, that is what we call as compound obligation. Now, in compound obligation, there are also two kinds of compound obligation. One, you have the conjunctive compound obligation, or where there are several prestations and all of them are due. There is not much complication with regard to conjunctive compound obligation because it is just like many simple obligation. Okay? Mura na siya daghan nga simple obligation ang conjunctive compound obligation. Nga naman, because all of the object in conjunctive compound obligation must be given or must be performed by the debtor. So for example, Maria promised to give Pedro a car and a motorcycle. So here we have two objects of the obligation, two prestations. Okay? Now all of these prestation must be given to the creditor, okay, or must be performed. Now if you look at it, Maria must give a car. At the same time, Maria must also give a Pedro. Kung imo nang i-divide, it is just like there are two simple obligation. Okay? So basically, when we speak about conjunctive compound obligation, there is not much complication as regard to its rules. Okay. Now, however, when it comes to distributive compound obligation or the second kind of compound obligation, or one where there are two or more prestation, but the performance of either one or more prestation is already enough to fulfill the obligation. this is more complicated because here it is more of the debtor will have to choose which of the prestation must be performed or must be given unto the creditor. Okay? So we have complicated rules here since there must be a governing rule when it comes to prior to the fulfillment of the obligation, like when the object is lost. When one of the objects is lost, what would be the prevailing rule? If who caused the loss, and then who has the right to choose. So these are a bit complications when it comes to distributive compound obligation. But anyway, we will discuss also the different rules related to the different kinds of distributive compound obligations. Okay? Now, there are two kinds of distributive compound obligations. One is an alternative obligation, while second is a facultative obligation. Speaking of alternative obligation, it is one where there are several prestations but the performance of one is already sufficient. So from the word alternative, here the debtor is given alternate choices. Okay? Which among the prestation will be given to the creditor. Okay? So here, there are many prestations or there are many objects of the obligation. But the debtor or the creditor may only choose one or two among the object or the prestation. So that's an alternative obligation. Facultative obligation. A facultative obligation is the second kind of distributive compound obligation where there is only one prestation but there is also a substitute. Okay? So here, there is one prestation or one object, but there is another object which is considered as a substitute. Okay? So looking at these two kinds of distributive compound obligation, it simply means that all of this, whether alternative obligation and facultative obligation, involves at least two objects. But the performance or but the delivery of one object is already enough to fulfill the obligation. Okay? So now we need to study or know also the rules relative to these two kinds of obligation, the alternative and facultative obligation. Let's start first with alternative obligation. As mentioned earlier, an alternative obligation is one wherein there are various prestations but the performance of one of them is sufficient, okay, as determined by the choice which as a general rule belongs to the debtor. Okay. So looking at this definition, we can draw out already two rules with regard to alternative obligations. Okay? So, therefore, in alternative obligations, there are many prestations. Okay? There are many prestations, but the performance of one prestation is already sufficient to fulfill the obligation. Okay? That's on the basis of the definition of what is an alternative obligation. Okay. Now, let's jump directly to the rules. Rule number 1 states, okay, this is in relation to alternative obligation. First rule in alternative obligation. Performance of one prestation is sufficient for the fulfillment of the obligation. The creditor cannot be compelled to receive part 1 and part of the other undertaking. Okay. So, again, in alternative obligations, there are many prestations. Okay? But only one among the prestation is required in order to fulfill the obligation. Example, as payment of his debt to B, it was agreed that A could pay back B a cash amount of 10,000 pesos or deliver his motorcycle to B. Okay. Looking at this example, there are two objects of this obligation or there are two prestations in this obligation. One is paying a cash amount of 10,000 pesos, or delivering the motorcycle of A in favor of B. So there are two prestations in this example. But based on this obligation, the performance of one, either the giving of the 10,000 or the delivery of the motorcycle, is already sufficient to fulfill the obligation. So that is precisely an alternative obligation. Now, first rule states that the performance of one prestation is already sufficient to fulfill the obligation. So, if the debtor A would give 10,000 pesos, then he need not give the motorcycle, because this is an alternative obligation. If the debtor A would give the motorcycle, then he need not give already the 10,000 pesos because the obligation will be extinguished already. Okay? So that's alternative obligation based on the first rule. However, second sentence of the first rule states that the creditor cannot be compelled to receive part 1 and part of the other undertaking, which means that in our example, B, the creditor, cannot be compelled to accept partially of the first undertaking and another partial on the second undertaking. Like when A would say, "Oh B, wala man ko'y kulang man ang akong kwarta karon. So I would only give you 5,000 pesos and then part of the motorcycle." Can you compel the creditor to accept that kind of payment? Now, based on rule number 1, it states that you cannot compel the creditor to accept those kind of payment because it should be a selection of one of the prestation, not a combination of all of the prestations. Okay? That is rule number 1. Then rule number 2. Under rule number 2, it states that the choice of the performance belongs to the debtor unless it has been expressly granted to the creditor. Okay, what does it mean? It means that if there is no agreement between the debtor and the creditor in alternative obligations, the right to choose which of the prestations should be fulfilled belongs to the debtor. Okay? So kung wala sila nagkasabot, then automatic si debtor ang naay right to choose which of the prestations is he going to perform or to deliver. Okay? Now, the only time that the creditor has the right to choose is when the parties, meaning the debtor and the creditor, agreed that the right to choose will belong to the creditor. Okay. Example, as payment of his debt to B, it was agreed that A could pay back B a cash amount of 10,000 pesos or deliver his motorcycle to B. In this kind of obligation, is there an agreement that the right to choose will be given to the creditor or to B? Since there is no mention of such thing, then there is no such agreement. And therefore, absence of the agreement, then it shall be the debtor who has the right to choose. Okay? So si A ang pwede ra mo pili ani nga example. Kung 10,000 ba ang iyang ibayad or ang motorcycle ba ang ibayad niya. Okay. Now, another example. When the creditor has the right to choose, going back to the same example, as payment of his debt to B, it was agreed that A could pay back B a cash amount of 10,000 pesos or deliver his motorcycle to B at the option of B. Okay? So there is now an added phrase, at the option of B. So it is clear now that there is an agreement that the right to choose which among the prestation would be fulfilled now belongs or is given to the creditor, who is B. So this time, it will be B who has given the option to choose whether to receive 10,000 pesos or the motorcycle. Okay? So that's the second rule. Now, rule number 3 in alternative obligation relates to remedies. Okay? Now, first rule under 3 or 3A. If the debtor cannot make a choice according to the terms of the obligation through the creditor's act, he may rescind the contract with damages. Now, these first two rules, A and B, under Rule 3, relates only when the right to choose is given to the debtor. Okay? Dili ning mo apply ang A o B if the right to choose is given to the creditor. Okay? Ang kaniyang A and B, ayaran ni mo ni i-apply kung ang right to choose belongs to the debtor. So first rule, 3A, if the debtor cannot make a choice according to the terms of the obligation through the creditor's act, he may rescind the contract with damages. Okay? What does it mean? It means that if the debtor cannot anymore exercise his right to choose as agreed by the parties, kay either nawala na ang isa ka object through the creditor's act, then he can now cancel the contract. That's rescission. He can cancel the contract and ask for damages. Okay. Example, Juan agreed to deliver either item 1, item 2, or item 3 to Pedro. Okay. Now, if item 2 will be lost by reason of the act of Pedro, si Pedro man ang creditor, siguro gisunog ni Pedro ang item 2 kay mas gusto ni Pedro ang item 1 o item 3. Unsa may right ni Juan? So you determine first, in this kind of example, who has the right to choose. Since wala man nila gi-agree kinsay na ay right to choose, automatic dayon ang na ay right to choose is si debtor, so si Juan. Okay. Now then you apply now rule 3A. Now if item 2 will be lost by reason of the act of Pedro, can Juan now make a choice according to their agreement? Not anymore. Nga naman, kaya ang nabilin item 1 raman o item 3. Di na siya pwede kapili sa item 2 kay gidaot man ni Pedro. So in that case, he cannot anymore exercise his right to choose according to their agreement. So what will happen? Then Rule 3A states that Juan can cancel the contract and ask for damages from Pedro. Okay? That's Rule 3A. Then Rule 3B. It states here, the creditor shall have the right to damages when through the fault of the debtor, all things which are alternatively the object of the obligation have been lost or compliance is already impossible. Okay? Rule 3B again is only applicable when the right to choose belongs to the debtor. Pag ang right to choose belongs to the creditor, dili ni ma-apply ang Rule 3B. Okay, example, under Rule 3B, Juan agreed to deliver either item 1, item 2, item 3 to Pedro. Karon, ingon si Juan, di man ko ganahan aning item 1 and item 2. Gisunog ni Juan ang item 1 and item 2. Item 3 na lang nabilin. Question, is Rule 3B applicable in this kind of scenario? Then, the answer is no, it is not applicable because it is only applicable, 3B is only applicable when all of the prestations have been lost. Okay? And it will result to the impossibility of complying the obligations. Okay? Ay harani siya mahitabo, ma-apply nimo kung tanan items wala na. Kung nabinlan pa og isa ka item, then there's no effect. Why is there no effect? Because the loss of the item is caused by the debtor, Juan. But the right to choose belongs also to the debtor, Juan. So in effect, when Juan destroyed item 1 and item 2, it simply means that he has exercised his right to choose item 3. Okay? So kung gisunog niya ang item 1, it means dili siya ganahan pilion ang item 1. Kung gisunog niya ang item 2, dili siya ganahan pilion ang item 3. Ang problema lang, kung sunugon ni Juan ang item 1, 2, or 3. In that case, there will be already an impossibility of complying the obligation. Kaya nahurot naman ang prestation, wala na yung prestation. So definitely, the creditor or Pedro will have a right against Juan. And under Rule 3B states that the creditor may ask for damages. Okay? So that's Rule 3B. And then Rule 3C. Okay. Now in Rule 3C, this applies when the right to choose belongs to the creditor. Okay? Kang creditor na ang right to choose sa 3C. Okay. It says here, if choice is given to the creditor before communication of the choice, the following rules shall apply. Okay. Wala pa nakamanifest si creditor. Asa iyang pilion. Let's still use the same example. Juan agreed to deliver item 1, item 2, or item 3 at the option of Pedro. Okay? So that makes the example now, the right to choose given to the creditor. Okay. First rule, if the thing is lost through fortuitous event. Oh, you remember fortuitous event? These are events which cannot be foreseen, or even if foreseen is inevitable. Okay? Like the acts of God or acts of nature. Okay? That is fortuitous event. Now, if the thing is lost through fortuitous event, like for example, item 3 is lost by reason of a fortuitous event, then the debtor is not liable. Okay? The creditor can choose from the remainder. So si Pedro makapili pa either item 2 or item 1. Okay? Because wala may sala si Juan na nung nawala ang item 3 considering that it is lost by reason of a fortuitous event. Okay. Number 2, if the thing is lost through debtor's fault, or this time it is not anymore fortuitous event, it is already through fault of the debtor. Okay? If the thing is lost through fault of the debtor, the creditor may claim any of the remainder or demand the value of what was lost with right to damages. Okay. So going back to the example, if na wala ang item 1 by reason of the act of Juan, okay, ang right ni Pedro is either pwede siya mupili lang sa item 2 or item 3, or pwede po si Pedro mangayo sa value sa item 1 nga nawala with damages. Okay? So remember again, this rule will apply when the right to choose belongs to the creditor. Number 3, when all things are lost through fault of the debtor, the creditor may demand payment of the price of any one of the choices with right to damages. So going back to the example, if nawala ang item 1, item 2, and item 3 by reason of the act of Juan, then ang right ni Pedro is to demand the value of either item 1, item 2, or item 3 plus damages. Okay. Then rule number 4. When all of the things are lost through fortuitous event, okay, meaning ang tanan prestation, item 1, item 2, or item 3, nawala through fortuitous event, then the obligation shall be extinguished. Okay? So, walay duty si debtor, wala po'y duty si creditor since the loss of the prestation or the object of the obligation is caused by a fortuitous event. In that case, the obligation will be extinguished. Okay? Okay. Let's proceed. Next is the facultative obligation. This is the second kind of a distributive compound obligation, which is the facultative obligation. Okay. Now, based on the definition, a facultative obligation is one where there is only one prestation has been agreed but the obligor may render another in substitution. Okay. Isara ang object in facultative obligation, but there is a reserved object which is considered as a substitute. Now, what's the difference between alternative obligation and facultative obligation? The difference between the two is that in alternative obligation, there are many prestations. Okay? And the debtor may choose among the prestations, or sometimes the creditor is the one who has given the right to choose which of the prestations will be performed. In facultative obligation, although there are many objects but only one, okay, there is only one definite object, but the other object is merely used as a substitute. Okay? It is merely used as a substitute. Only one prestation but a substitute at the will of the debtor is provided. Okay? Now, in facultative obligation, the right to choose always belongs to the debtor. Okay? Sa facultative obligation. Sa alternative obligation, the right to choose may be given to the creditor upon agreement of the parties. Pero pag-abot ni mo sa facultative obligation, the right to choose always belongs to the debtor. Dili mahitabo nga si creditor ang dunay right to choose. Okay? Sa facultative obligation. Example, I will give you my car or I may give you my bicycle as a substitute. So here, the prestation is the car and another object which is used as a substitute is the bicycle. So, the debtor here has always have the right to choose kung unsa iyang ihatag, ang main obligation ba nga car or ang substitute ba nga bicycle. Okay? So, there are only two rules with regard to facultative obligation. Before substitution, the loss of the substitute will not create any liability. Obviously, dili siya maka-create og liability because wala may right to choose ang creditor. It's always the debtor. And then, second rule is that the choice is always given to the debtor. Okay? So that's facultative obligation. Mas dili kaayo complicated ang facultative obligation as compared against alternative obligation. Now, let's go to another classification of obligation. This time, we are going to classify the obligation according to the number of parties. Okay? Number of parties, meaning the number of debtors or the number of creditors. That's how we are going to classify this kind of obligation. Now, since there are many debtors and there are also many creditors, we will try to identify what are the liabilities of these debtors and what are the rights of these creditors. We can only do so or identify their liabilities and their rights when we are able to classify the kind of obligation as to the number of parties. Now, there are two kinds of obligation as to the number of parties. One is a joint obligation and then second is a solidary obligation. Joint obligation, it is one where the whole obligation is to be paid or fulfilled proportionately by different debtors and or is to be demanded proportionately by different creditors. Okay. Unsa di ay ang joint obligation? Ingon niya, joint obligation kung ang liability sa debtor proportionate, meaning kung duha ka buk debtor A and B nangutang kay C, kung ang liability sa duha ka debtor is proportionate, meaning kung 100,000 ang ilang iutang, tagpa 500,000 sila, kung tag 50,000 sila, si debtor A would pay 50,000, si debtor B would pay 50,000, then that is what we call as joint obligation. Okay? Now, second kind, solidary obligation. One where each one of the debtors is bound to render and or each one of the creditors has the right to demand from any of the debtors entire compliance with the prestation. Si solidary obligation, lahi pud pag-abot nimo kay solidary obligation, mo ni siyang ingon nga kung unsay utang niya, utang nako as a whole. Okay? Kung unsay entitlement sa isa ka creditor, entitlement pod sa lain creditor. So assuming A and B borrowed money from C, the amount of 100,000 and agreed themselves that they will be solidarily liable. Okay, so it's a solidary obligation. Pag solidary obligation, si C, who is the creditor, can demand fulfillment of the entire obligation either from A or B. Okay? So pwede mo demand si C o 100,000 kang A or kang B because their obligation is solidary. So sa laktod na pagkaistorya, ang joint obligation manifest the mentality kada bitawng iya, ako. Eh? Kung unsa iya. Kung unsa ako. Ang solidary obligation manifest one for all and all for one. Eh? So that's solidary obligation. Example, Juan and Pedro borrowed money from Lisa the amount of 10,000 pesos. Okay. That's the obligation. Of course, when Juan and Pedro borrowed money from Lisa, they have also the obligation to pay back the 10,000 pesos. Now, if this obligation is joint, pag joint ni siya, then Juan can only be held liable to Lisa up to the amount that Juan benefited when they borrowed money. Okay. So kung 10,000 ang ilang gihulam, unya 1,000 pesos lang ang iabot kay Juan, then ang bayro ni Juan ngadto kay Lisa under joint obligation is only 1,000. Kinsay mo bayad sa 9,000? Si Pedro ang mubayad sa 9,000. Kaya 9,000 man ang gipaingon sa iya. Now, kung gi-assume nga liability ni Juan and Pedro is solidary, meaning solidary obligation siya, then ang liability ni Juan is 10,000. Or ang liability ni Pedro is also 10,000. So, which means Lisa can collect the entire 10,000 either from Juan or from Pedro. Because the obligation is solidary. Okay? Pero, pag makakolekt na po si Lisa og 10,000 gikan kay Juan, then dili na siya pwede mo collect kay Pedro. Okay. So the only question now remains is how do we identify whether the obligation is joint and solidary? Okay. So here are the rules. Let's start first with joint obligations. Now, first, where there is plurality of parties, the presumption is that the obligation is joint. Okay. Ingon niya itong binisayon. Kung daghan gani ang parties, the presumption is that it is a joint obligation. Okay? Meaning, kung more than one ang debtor or more than one ang creditor, unya walay agreement nga imong makita nga nag-agree sila nga solidary ang obligation, automatic the obligation is solidary. I mean, joint. Okay? So let's go back to our example earlier. Juan and Pedro borrowed money from Lisa the amount of 10,000 pesos. What kind of obligation as to the number of parties is this example? Now, since wala man kay makita nga nag-agree sila nga solidary ni siya nga obligation, then the obligation is presumed to be a joint obligation. Okay? Kaya wala may statement diri nga solidary siya. Okay. That's the first rule. Second rule, in joint obligations, there are as many debts as there are debtors, and there are as many credits as many creditors. Okay? So sa joint obligation, di ay kung pila ka debtor, maupod na kadaghan ang utang. Kung pila pud ka creditor, maupod na kadaghan ang entitled anang utang. So let's go back to our example earlier. Juan and Pedro borrowed money from Lisa the amount of 10,000 pesos. Since there is no word of solidarity here, then it is presumed to be a joint obligation. Giklaro naman nato na kanina. So question, how many debts are there here in this kind of example? Since there are 2 debtors, then there are also 2 debts. How many credits? Since there is only 1 creditor, then there is 1 credit. If daghan ang creditor ani, daghan pod ang credit under joint obligation. Okay? So that's rule number 2. 3. The debts or credits are considered distinct and separate from the other. Going back to this example, Juan borrowed money from Lisa, the amount of 10,000 pesos. Ingon niya under rule number 3 that each debt is distinct and separate from the other. So ang katong liability di ay ni Juan is distinct and separate from the liability of Pedro. Diling pwede paninglo ni Lisa ang utang ni Juan. Example, ang nakuha ni Juan diri sa 10,000 is 1,000 lang. Then, ang kana separate ang liability. Walay labot si Juan kung wala kabayad si Pedro. Kay iya-iya man eh. Under joint obligation. Kung dili makabayad si Pedro, then walay labot si Juan kung makabayad si Juan. Kung makabayad si Juan, discharge na siya sa iyang obligation. And vice versa. Si Pedro pod walay labot kung dili makabayad si Juan. Okay? If makabayad si Pedro, then discharge na pod si Pedro. That is what is meant by when the debts or credits are considered as distinct and separate from one another. Number 4. Each debtor is liable only for a proportionate part of the debt, and each creditor is entitled only for a proportionate part of the credit. Okay. Tungod kay iya-iya man ang joint obligation, then ang liability sa every debtor is only up to the amount na benefit sa iya. Okay. So kaning example nato, kung ang na-benefit ni Juan is only 1,000, ang liability ni Juan is only 1,000 also. Kung ang na-benefit ni Pedro is 9,000, then ang liability po ni Pedro is also 9,000. Then number 5, words indicating joint liabilities. Okay. Mao ni siyang mag-manifest na ang liability sa parties or sa debtor is joint. When you see the word joint, proportionate, pro rata. Pag naa kanini nga mga words, it means the obligation is a joint obligation. So example, Juan and Pedro borrowed money from Lisa the amount of 10,000 pesos and both promised to pay Lisa jointly. Na ay word nga joint. So it means that the obligation is a joint obligation. Or Juan and Pedro borrowed money from Lisa the amount of 10,000 pesos and both of them promised to pay Lisa proportionately. It's clear that the obligation is a joint obligation. What if walay gisulat sa ilang liability? Ang gisulat lang is Juan and Pedro borrowed money from Lisa the amount of 10,000 pesos. So what would be the kind of obligation? You go back to rule number 1. Where there is plurality of parties, the presumption is that the obligation is joint. So you go back to the presumption. Therefore, the obligation is a joint obligation. Okay, let's go back. Now we deal with the rules on solidary obligation. First thing that we should do is how to identify whether the obligation is a solidary obligation. Earlier, we had discussed how to identify whether the obligation is a joint obligation. So as a recap, we know if it is a joint obligation when there are many debtors or where there are many creditors and there is no agreement as to the liabilities of these debtors and as to the entitlement or rights of this creditor. The presumption is that it is a joint obligation. Meaning, kung wala may makita nga nag-agree sila nga ilang liability is solidary, then automatic siya nga joint obligation. Okay? Now, that's one. Another way also of identifying whether it's a joint obligation is when you find the words jointly or joint, proportionately or in proportion, or pro rata. If these words appear in an obligation, then it is a joint obligation. So in solidary obligation, the way to identify whether an obligation is solidary or not is based on rule number 1. There is solidary liability only when, number 1, the obligation expressly so states, meaning the obligation itself states that the obligation is solidary. For example, Juan and Maria promised to pay Pedro the amount of 10,000 pesos solidarily. Okay? So the obligation itself has stated that the liability of the debtor is solidary. Okay. Second, the law requires solidarity, meaning the source of the obligation here is the law, and the law itself also mentioned that the liability of the debtor should be solidary liability. Third, the nature of the obligation requires solidarity. Okay? So here, based on the obligation that has been incurred by the debtor, the nature of which dictates that the liabilities of the debtor must be solidarily. Okay? Now, when the obligation is through and imposed by final judgment against several defendants. Meaning here, there is a case that has been filed and then the court has decided in favor of the creditor, we call that as judgment creditor, against several debtors or against several defendants. Here, the presumption is that it is a solidary obligation. Okay? Now, there are also 3 kinds of solidarity. We have passive solidarity, which means that there is solidarity on the part of the debtors. And then you have active solidarity. There is solidarity on the part of the creditors, and mixed solidarity. Solidarity on both the debtors and the creditors. Second rule, there is only one debt and one credit regardless of the number of parties. Or remember, joint obligation, there are as many obligations or there are as many debts as there are number of debtors, and as many credits as there are number of creditors. That's in joint obligation. But in solidary obligations, there is only one debt and one credit, regardless of the number of debtors and creditors. Again, as what I have told you earlier, in solidary obligation, it's a one for all for one thing. Third rule, any of the debtor can be held liable of the whole amount due, and or any of the creditor is entitled to the whole amount due. Okay? And then fourth, words of solidarity, meaning if you find these words in an obligation, it means that the obligation is solidary. When you find the word solidary, okay, or solidarily. Second, when you find the word joint and solidary. Pag joint lang, then it's a joint obligation. Pero coupled with the words solidary, meaning joint and solidary, it's already a solidary obligation. Individually and collectively, that's joint obligation. In solidum, that's also joint obligation. Each will pay whole value, that's also joint obligation. Okay. Number 5, each one of the solidary creditors may do whatever may be useful to others, but not which is prejudicial. Hence, cannot also assign his rights without consent of the other creditors. This pertains now to the rights of the creditors. Since there is only one debt and one credit, therefore, the creditor, assuming there are many creditors, the act of one creditor, which is beneficial to the other creditor, is considered also a valid act of such creditor. Okay? That is joint and solidary obligation. So let's have an illustration. Okay, next, another classification of obligation is according to object. This is another kind of classification according to object. Kanina, nag-classify tawag obligation according to object also. Whether as to the number of, number of object. Whether it's a simple or compound obligation. But this time, according to object as, according to the nature of the object. Not as to the number of objects, but according to the nature of object. So under this classification, an obligation may either be divisible obligation or indivisible obligation. Okay? Now, indivisible obligation, these are kinds of obligations which are capable of partial performance. Meaning, ang imong object sa obligation, pwede nimo i-perform partially. Okay? Like for example, A promise to deliver 200 kilos of sugar. So, pwede i-perform ni A partially ang iyang obligation. Pwede 100 lang sa, and then afterwards, 200. That's divisible obligation. In indivisible obligation, here, it is not capable of partial performance. Okay? Like for example, to deliver a specific car. Di man mo pwede, unahon lang ang ligid o deliver. So in that case, the object is an indivisible object. The nature of the object is an indivisible object. So that is what we call as indivisible obligations. Now, it is important to determine this kind of obligation for the applications on the rule on joint and solidary obligations. Okay? Kaya na may i-apply na po nimo ang rule sa joint and solidary obligations, na siya variation dayon. So that's why you need to identify whether the obligation is divisible or indivisible obligations. So let's go with the rules. In joint obligations, debtors who does not comply with his undertakings can be held liable for damages. However, debtors who are ready to fulfill, to contribute to the indemnity beyond their corresponding portions of the price of the thing or the value of the service. Okay. Example, Car and Len promise jointly to give a specific car worth 5 million to Al. Okay. Here, the kind of obligation is a joint obligation. Why is it a joint obligation? Because of the word jointly. So that's why it's a joint obligation. Now, in joint obligation, we know that there are as many debts as there are number of debtors, and there are as many credits as there are number of debtor. Okay. Kung solidary, ang ilang obligation ani, walay problema. Because Al may demand the entire car from either Carl or Len. Pero ang problema, kay joint man siya. So, diling pwede i-demand ni Al ang entire car from Len or from kay Carl. Because each will only be liable for its own proportion. Okay. So, daw kung dili pa kaya ni Len mo perform sa iyang obligation, pero kaya na ni Carl mo perform sa obligation, dili man pwede tungaon nimo ang car. Because the object here is an indivisible object. Di man pwede nimo ma-partial performance ang sakyanan. Now, kung divisible ang object ani, wala problema. Like for example, Carl and Len promise to give jointly in favor of Al 200 kilos of rice. In that case, 100 kay Carl, 100 kay Len. Pwede siyang partial performance. Pag dili pa ready si Len, then si Al mo demand lang sa 100 una. Kay Carl, pwede ihatag ni Carl yung 100 kilos. Later on, kay Len, pwede na po ng 100 kilos. Ang problema ni nga example is that the object is indivisible object. Diling pwede tungaon ang sakyanan. So, saan na nila karon? Now, the rule states that the obligation should be converted into a monetary one for indemnity. So, dili na mahimo nga ang car mo i-deliver. Kay lisod man sad katunga sa karang i-deliver. So, kung i-convert siya into a monetary obligation. So, since there is a value of the car which is 1.5 million, therefore, the obligation now is 1.5 million. Then, the debtor who is ready to fulfill his or her obligation shall not be held liable more than his or corresponding portion of the price. So, kung tunga sila aning obligation. Therefore, ang kolektahon kay Carl is only 750,000. Ang kolektahon pud kay Len is also 750,000. And then third, the defaulting debtor is liable to the creditor. Katong dili makatag sa 750,000, then he would be liable to the debtor. Okay? So that's the rule in case of joint indivisible obligation. In case of divisible contract, if the illegal term can be separated from the legal ones, the latter may be enforced. That's applicable in divisible contract. Kung naay illegality of the object in indivisible contract, i-separate nimo ang illegal object from the legal object. And then only the legal object can be enforced. Okay? So that's it with the divisible and indivisible obligation. And then the last kind of obligation is the obligation with a penal clause. Unsa maning obligation with a penal clause? These are obligations which carries with it penalties in case the debtor fails to perform his obligation or defaults in the performance of his obligation. Na siya own penalties. So it contains a penal clause, what we call as a penal clause, in case of default on the part of the debtor. Okay. So, a penal clause is a coercive means to obtain from the debtor compliance. Okay. What's the purpose there sa penal clause? The purpose of the penal clause is in order to compel the debtor to comply. Otherwise, kung dili siya mag-comply, then he can be held liable for penalty. Now, this is very common when you borrow money from banks or from other financial institution, because the contract in that case, or if you're going to borrow money from banks, would contain that in case you would not pay on the period stipulated, you will be liable for surcharges, interest, and penalties. Okay? So, that is what we call as a penal clause. Okay? If you fail to pay your amortization at a stipulated date, then muhatag silang interest. And plus, surcharges pa yun. Okay? That is the penalty. Or that is what we call as the penal clause. When the obligation has this kind of clause or contains these kinds of provision, it means that the obligation is an obligation with a penal clause. Okay? So that's it with the different kinds of obligation. Then the last topic under obligations and contract is extinguishment of the obligation. Now, in extinguishment of the obligation, it simply means the end of the obligation. Okay? It is the killing of the obligation. Okay? Ending the obligation. So, question is, how do we extinguish an obligation? For example, A promised B the amount of 10,000 pesos. So, naay obligation si A ngadto kay B og 10,000 pesos. Kano sa na siya ma-extinguish? Now, we have to look at the law on the grounds for extinguishing an obligation. There are 6 grounds mentioned by law. One is payment or performance. Second is loss of the thing due. Third is condonation or remission of debt. Fourth is confusion or merger of rights of creditor and debtor. Fifth is compensation. And then sixth is novation. Okay. Going back to our example, A promised B the amount of 10,000 pesos. Here, A has an obligation of 10,000 pesos. When will the obligation be extinguished? Kano sa siya mawala? Number 1, through payment or performance. Kung mubayad na si A ngadto kay B, that's payment or performance. So the obligation will end. The obligation will be done. Second, loss of the thing due. Kung ang object sa obligation mawala, then the obligation will also be extinguished, provided that the loss is not at the fault of the debtor. Kaya kung fault ni debtor ang loss, then debtor could be held liable. Third, condonation or remission of debt. Meaning naluoy ang creditor. So gikondone niya. Okay? Gikondone niya si debtor. Ngayon na lang nabayri. Okay? Or remission. Giwala niya ang utang. And that is also one way of extinguishing an obligation. And then confusion or merger of rights of creditor and debtor. si creditor nahimo pong debtor at the same time. Okay? Sa iyang kaugalingon. Like for example, nag-issue kong cheque, ako si debtor, nag-issue kong cheque, and then ang cheque, gi-negotiate into other person, and eventually, nipaingon og balik sa ako. So ako, at the same time, debtor at nga cheque, at the same time, creditor also at nga cheque. So there is now confusion on the rights of the debtor and the creditor. So that is one way also of extinguishing an obligation. Compensation. Okay. Compensation is when the debtor becomes the creditor of the original debtor or original creditor. So, in effect, ako nangutang sa laing tao, later on, kato na pong laing tao, nangutang na pod sa ako. So, there is now compensation. I-offset ang akong utang o giyang utang. So, that is compensation. And then last is novation. Innovation, there is now a change of object. Okay? Change of object or change of subject matter of the obligation. Okay? Like for example, I promise to pay or I promise to give a specific car in favor of Juan. So the object there is a specific car. But then, ingon si Juan, ayaw na lang na. Ihatag ang specific car, tagain na lang kog 100,000. So there is now a change in the subject matter of the obligation from a specific car to 100,000. So unsay may tabo sa obligation nimo sa to deliver a specific car? The law says it is now extinguished. Ngano extinguished man siya? Because of novation. Because there is a change of a subject matter or object of the obligation. Or innovation also, it can be a change of the parties. Okay? Usabon ang parties. Like for example, I promise to pay the amount of 100,000 pesos in favor of Juan. Later on, ingon ko kay Juan, pwede ba? Nga di na lang kumubayad sa imo. Kanina lang si Pedro mubayad sa imo, kaya nani utang si Pedro sa ako ng 100,000. Ning sugot si Juan. Okay? So now there is a change of parties. So what will happen with my obligation to Juan? It will be extinguished on the basis of novation. Okay? So there is a change of parties. So in effect, when we talk about extinguishment of the obligation, we are now ending the obligation. So the effect, if the obligation will end, then the relationship as debtor and creditor will also cease. Wala na debtor, wala na po'y creditor. Now, each of the grounds mentioned by law as grounds for extinguishment of an obligation has also its own requisite. You may go over from slide 75 up to slide number 92 with regard to the requisites of different grounds for extinguishing an obligation. Okay?